There's only so much text that can fit on a single line, but we often want to cram as much text on each line as possible. So one solution is to break words at the end of a line with a hyphen. However, sometimes you want to control where a hyphen is and where it's not. I'm going to jump to the second page of this document by pressing Shift Page Down, and then I'm going to zoom in on this portion of the document so we can play with hyphenation. First thing I notice here is that this word is hyphenating. Actually, I've got two words hyphenating here in a paragraph that I really wish there was no hyphenation at all. I can turn off hyphenation for a paragraph by selecting it, place the cursor anywhere in the paragraph at all, and turn off the hyphenate checkbox in the control panel. Now this checkbox only shows up when you're in paragraph mode. Turn that off, and it turns off the hyphenation for the entire paragraph. Now let's turn our attention to this paragraph up here. I'm going to place my cursor in this paragraph and open up the hyphenation dialog box. And this hyphenation dialog box is going to control hyphenation. For example, I can control what the minimum size of a word should be before it gets hyphenated. If I bump this up from 6 to 7, watch what happens. The word create got bumped down to the next line because it has 6 letters in it, and the minimum is now 7. I could see that happening because the preview checkbox is turned on in this dialog box. You can also control things like the number of letters that have to be before a hyphen or after the hyphen, and there's this wonderful slider down here that lets you control your hyphenation interactively toward more hyphens or toward better spacing along the sides. This dialog box gives you a lot of control. Here's some checkboxes that also let you control hyphenation. Hyphenate capitalized words. I can see that my word Dragonwell here is being hyphenated, and I just don't like the look of that, so I'm going to turn that off. Now my proper nouns and other words that are capitalized will not be hyphenated at all. Hyphenated across column, which is new in CS3, is wonderful for book publishers because in the book publishing industry you often don't want a word to hyphenate across from one page to the next. So simply turn off hyphenated across column and those words won't hyphenate anymore. To show you hyphenate last word, I'm going to click OK and place my cursor down in this paragraph. See, the last word of this paragraph is leaving these 4 letters right down here. It's hyphenating right at the very end and leaving this, what I call a runt, at the bottom of the paragraph. And I can turn that off by once again going back to hyphenation and turning off hyphenate last word. It's as simple as that. Click OK. What if you see a word that really needs hyphenation or hyphenation in a different place? For example, this word here, copymaker, just looks weird to me. So I'm going to place the cursor between the E and the M, and I'm going to tell InDesign that I'd prefer that it hyphenate here. There's various ways to do this, but the easiest way is to add a discretionary hyphen. I don't want to add an actual hyphen. I actually press the hyphen key because later, if the text reflows, I don't want a hyphen to be right in the middle of that word. I want a discretionary hyphen that will show up when it's needed and disappear when it's not needed. And you can find the discretionary hyphen under the Type menu, Insert Special Character, Hyphens and Dashes, Discretionary Hyphen, or press Command-Shift-Hyphen or Control-Shift-Hyphen to add a discretionary hyphen. And you can see that that hyphen now shows up after the word coffee. But if I add a word before this, just type some random text in here, you can see that the hyphen disappears. Discretionary hyphens are wonderful. Now I'm going to justify all the text in this story by pressing Command-A or Control-A on Windows to select all the text, and then I'm going to click on Force Justify to make sure everything is justified out there. I'll take away this text here, and we can see that this hyphen after the word T is kind of indented slightly. All the punctuation is indenting slightly. I don't get a clean edge along my margin. Well, I can control that, and I can force that off into the side using something that some people call hanging punctuation, but is accurately called optical margin alignment. And I can find that feature by choosing the Type menu, selecting Story, and looking in the Story panel. The Story panel has one feature and one feature only, that's optical margin alignment. And when I turn that on, this story, whatever story I had the cursor in when I turned it on, gets optically margin aligned. And I can see that all the punctuation, especially hyphens, get pushed out just a little bit so that it's visually clean. Believe it or not, InDesign has even more hyphenation controls than this, but those are more advanced topics that we'll cover in a later title. As you can see, even these tools provide a huge amount of control over your hyphenation. Someone, somewhere decided that text looked good when it aligned on both the left and right sides of a column, called justified text. And we saw various options for creating justified text earlier in this chapter. Now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty of controlling how InDesign justifies your text. I'm going to jump to page 2 again by pressing Shift Page Down, and I'll zoom in on this part of the page. I'll select these 2 frames with a selection tool, and then switch to the Type tool so that I can control the justification without actually selecting the text. Now all the text in both of these frames is set to justify, but just because you turn it doesn't mean even color throughout the paragraph. Do you know what I mean by color? I'm not talking about red or blue text. You can see typographic color if you squint your eyes until everything gets a bit blurry and you see just the overall grayness of a line or a paragraph. You don't want a paragraph to look patchy with areas of light and dark. You want even color throughout. So InDesign has this thing called the Paragraph Composer, which tries to make sure you get as even as possible color throughout a paragraph. But we can control the Paragraph Composer as well as what settings it uses to justify your text by selecting Justification from the flyout menu on the control panel. I'll move this dialog box out of the way so we can see better. And the first thing I'm going to point out here is the Composer down at the bottom. Right now it's set to Adobe Paragraph Composer, but if I change this to Adobe Single Line Composer, you get a very different effect. Single Line Composer works the same way as Quark Express or Microsoft Word or whatever. It basically figures out how much text can fit on a single line, and then it goes to the next line, forgetting what the previous line looked like. But when we set this to Paragraph Composer, like I said, it's always looking at the entire paragraph, and it's trying to figure out how to get the best look, the most even color throughout the whole paragraph. So in general, I just leave it set to Adobe Paragraph Composer. Now there are 3 ways to justify a line of text. You can do word spacing, which is adjusting the amount of space between each of the words on the line. You can do letter spacing, which is adjusting the amount of space between each letter in a word. And there's glyph scaling, which is stretching or squeezing each character just a little bit so that you get more even color. Now, many designers will tell you that you should never do letter or glyph scaling. You should only do word spacing. Only allow it to change the space between the words. But personally, maybe I'm not a purist. But, you know, in the magazine industry or the newspaper industry where you're on a deadline, you need to get this thing out fast, and you want as good type as possible quickly, well, in that case, go ahead and add a little bit of letter spacing and glyph scaling. I'll go in here, and with the preview checkbox turned on so I can see what's going on here, I'm going to change the letter spacing maybe minus 1 or 2%, and then I'll add 1 or 2% as well for letter spacing. That's going to be very difficult to see the difference between 1 or 2% of letter spacing, and yet we immediately get much better looking color throughout those paragraphs. Same thing with glyph scaling. I have no problem with adding, plus or minus 1% of glyph scaling, because I personally don't think you're going to see the difference with each character being maybe 99% of the horizontal width of what it used to be. I'll bump this down 1%, maybe 99%, maybe 98%, and I'll go up 1 or 2% as well. I just don't think you're going to notice the difference that much. And yet again, you can get much better quality by giving InDesign a little bit more flexibility of what it can stretch, what it can add in order to justify your text. Obviously, justifying text is as much an art as a science, but even with just a few tweaks like this here and there, you can get great improvements over the default settings and get much better looking type. When you press the Tab key on your keyboard, the text indents a certain amount. By default, it's a ½ inch. Now, tabs can be very helpful for setting the horizontal position of some text in a line, though in my opinion, they're highly overused and often cause more problems than they're worth. So, first, 3 ground rules. Never type a tab at the beginning of a paragraph in order to create an indent. That's what the left indent and the first line indent features are for. We talked about those earlier in this chapter. Second, never type 2 tab characters in a row. If you want your tab to take you farther than that little ½ inch, then set a tab stop. I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. Finally, if you're using tabs to make something that looks suspiciously like a table, it probably is a table, and you should probably use InDesign's table features instead of tabs. I'm going to cover the table features in a later chapter. Now, all that said, if you still want to use tabs, here's what you do. I've opened up the Java Code magazine from the exercise files, and I want to zoom in on this text frame down here. I'll press Command plus or Control plus on Windows a couple times just so I can zoom in here and see this text. In this case, I want each of these phrases to go on top of the picture. Beans on top of this picture, French press on top of this picture, and so on. And I can use tabs to make that happen. This text is all in one long text frame, so all I need to do is add a tab between each of these phrases. Tab here, and tab here. Now how do I get each of those in the right position? I need the tabs panel. I can find that up in the type menu. I choose tabs, and the types panel appears. In order to create a tab stop, I simply click anywhere along this ruler. I'll click one there, I'll click one here, and so on. Now notice that there are 4 different kinds of tab stops you can add to your tab ruler. In this case, I've added center tab stops, so this word is centered at that position. But I can change that simply by clicking on one of these other buttons. I could make it a left tab stop, in which case the left edge of the text is going to be positioned at that stop. I could make it a right tab stop, which means the right edge of that text is going to be there. Or if I were doing financial tables in which there were numbers with decimals, I could use the decimal tab stop. But in this case, I'm centering, so I'm using centered tab stops. I'll add one more over here on top of this picture. By the way, if you added a tab stop in here, 1 or 2 tab stops that you didn't mean to, it's very easy to delete them. You simply click on them and just drag right off the ruler. That deletes them. Okay, I've got my tab stops more or less in position, but the text isn't aligning properly. This one is, well, I'd like it over here. It's because I need to add a tab before the word beans. I know I just told you not to put a tab at the beginning of the paragraph, but here I am doing it anyway. I press tab, and now the beans moves over to the first tab stop, French press moves over to the second, and tools moves over to the third. If I need to adjust any of these, I simply click and drag the tab stop. Note that as you're dragging a tab stop, you can see a little vertical line in the text frame that indicates exactly where it's going to end up. Terrific. Now I'd like to add tab leaders. Leaders are characters that span the width of any tab. So in this case, I want to put a bunch of dots in between each of these words. So I select a tab stop, and I go to the leader field in the tabs panel, and a character. In this case, I'm going to type Option 8 or Alt 8 on Windows to get a bullet character. And when I press Return or Enter, you'll see those dots appear. Now I'll do the same thing with these other tab stops. Dot leader up here. So it goes from the beginning of the text frame all the way over to this word. And now I'll do one over on this tab stop as well. Dot leader with a bullet. Terrific. It could be a period. It could be really any character you want. Any character you type in there, it doesn't have to be a bullet. It could be a period or dollar signs or any character. Whatever character you type there will span the entire width of that tab. Now how do I get one over here? I could actually add one more tab stop right out here at the edge of the margin here, but adding a tab stop at the edge of the margin is notoriously difficult to do, actually. So instead, I'm going to use a special character. I'm not going to put a tab here. I'm going to put a right indent tab. And you can get one of those by going to the Type menu, going down to Special Characters, Insert Special Character, and then go to Other. And there it is, right indent tab, which you can get by pressing Shift Tab. There we go. There it is, a tab that goes all the way to the right margin as far as it can possibly go, and the dot leader is picked up by the previous tab stop. That's how the right indent tab knows what kind of leader it should use. It uses whatever leader was set to the last tab stop. Setting tabs and tab stops are typically important when you're creating table of contents, indexes, and other long documents that have some structure. And these essential tools will take you a long way toward making sure those documents look good.